Have you ever played a game of three-dimensional chess? Now, if you're a Star Trek nerd, you know Spock often played games of three-dimensional chess. It's quite complicated. With every move, you have to think of a different move in every direction. Forward, backwards, up, down, left, right. Today's episode feels no different. Today we're going to be talking about nuclear ethics.
The biggest discrepancy also between us and maybe the energy ethics community is that these people tend to focus on what can go wrong in certain circumstances.
That's Dr. Simone Friederich from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Dr. Friederich not only has a PhD in philosophy, but also physics. Most of his arguments are in the realm of quantum physics, which makes him probably better than me at three-dimensional chess. I stumbled across a paper he wrote titled Ethics of Nuclear Energy in Times of Climate Change, Escaping the Collective Action Problem.
The collective action problem aspect is more that in a global economy, or even on a more regional level, other people will jump in and will deliver the services, and maybe they will be the less scrupulous ones.
Here's the overarching question Dr. Friederich and his colleague decided to use to create this paper. To what extent should we be investing in nuclear energy as a strategy to mitigate climate change? And how can we evaluate current energy systems in place from an ethical framework? Some of those answers spin out questions. Some of those questions spin out answers. It's like the 3D chess thing. And so throughout this episode, we're going to be breaking down the criteria he and his colleague used to create this assessment and what they found. The answer to this question is yes. Yes, it is ethically required to invest in nuclear energy. But first, let's get some more background on Dr. Friederich and how he got here.
I'm usually a philosopher of physics mostly. I try to solve fundamental problems in quantum foundations, but I also do some philosophy of technology. And I got interested in nuclear energy roughly 12 years ago, a bit after the Fukushima accident, when I read up on what really the fatalities had been. Having been socialized in Germany in a very anti-nuclear background, I became pretty enthusiastic about the technology, even though my country of origin, Germany, was phasing out the technology. I got the idea to write a paper on this in maybe 2018 or 2019. Around the time of the Fukushima accident, they had set up an ethics commission to assess whether it was ethically defensible for Germany to continue to use nuclear energy for some time. As well as really a heavyweight commission with people, experts from especially the social sciences and also philosophers, a few engineers. And they recommended that Germany exit the technology quickly. And I thought, this is weird, right? These people are maybe smarter than I, so when they come to a very different conclusion. So let's engage with that. I got into contact with a Belgian colleague who had similar views to me, and we ended up writing that paper, which appeared, I think, 2 years ago.
If you're not up to speed with what happened in Germany, here's a bit of context. Germany is now looked at as a cautionary tale of what happens when you shut down all of your reactors without really insightful forethought of how you're going to replace that power lost within the grid. So how did Dr. Friederich come up with a completely different analysis than that of Germany's ethics commission?
It gives a very different assessment of what the key ethical issues are, and also provides some reasons for thinking that given certain plausible assumptions might actually be ethically mandatory for certain countries to invest quite heavily in further nuclear capacity rather than phasing it out. When reading this German study with the views of its authors, I think the biggest discrepancy also between us and maybe the entire energy ethics community is that these people tend to focus on what can go wrong in certain circumstances in terms of people's health, and in particular, how can we use less energy? I think these are all valid concerns, of course. But to Martin, my colleague, and to me, I mean, the bigger picture was really humans have fared so much better since we have been able to use a lot more energy. The nice developments of the last few decades or maybe 2 centuries in terms of how long people live, how much education people can have, more gender equality, have to do with the fact that humans have just more energy at their disposal. The collective action problem aspect is more that in a global economy, or even on a more regional level, because energy is so useful for getting around, to keeping you warm, and to produce all kinds of industrial goods and cement and steel. You need quite a lot of energy for that. If you, for the sake of protecting the climate in order not to have any emissions, if you don't do it, then it's to be expected that other people will jump in and will deliver the services, and maybe they will be the less scrupulous ones. This kind of reasoning is often used with dubious intention to just not take any responsibility, but that doesn't mean this mechanism is not active. So that's the collective action problem.
This is an important point to reiterate. Humans have fared so much better since we have been able to use energy. We can educate ourselves faster, build things better, and live overall better lives. However, in the spirit of clean energy and protecting the environment, if State A decides to cut back, then it's likely that State B might just take its place. And State B might not be as adherent to clean energy practices. But like Dr. Friederich said, this doesn't mean there's no use in trying to improve our energy systems and taking responsibility for our actions.
If we try to solve the problem by emitting significantly less, but others are happy to take over, then not so much is gained. The better way, if possible, is to substitute for the energy delivered from fossil fuels, and preferably have substitutes that are similarly affordable or even cheaper. That is not going to work for all parts of industry where we use fossil fuels. So some carbon capture would probably be necessary to get to net zero. But without relatively cheap carbon-free energy, it's not going to work. According to the analysis of the presuppositions of Martin and me, the use of nuclear power must be analyzed from an ethical standpoint against that background.
In their paper, this is what is referred to as substitutes must be cheap, or SMC. In the game of three-dimensional chess, or as I like to call it, nuclear ethics, completely altruistic actions can actually have adverse effects. This is the collective action problem. There are numerous players. So, with more pragmatic approaches, such as substitutes must be cheap, we can start to play the game in a way that has positive outcomes.
If the vast majority is happy to use other sources, and those sources are just as cheap or even cheaper, so that the fossil fuel users will have an economic disadvantage, then we are in reach of getting to very low or zero emissions. I am not a professional ethicist. Usually I do philosophy of physics, but I mean, we all have a basic education in ethics, and something that maybe some of your listeners have had that as well. So some of the most elementary things are that there are very different normative theories of ethics, or theories about what people should do. It's useful to distinguish roughly three types. One could distinguish more maybe, but three types are useful to distinguish. One are broadly consequentialist. These are approaches that say you should do whatever has the best consequences. So one would be a good outcome, what would be a great outcome, what would be a bad outcome. Another is duty-based. So to say that there is a canon of duties, and people should do what their duty is. What's your duty to not do any harm, or at least not avoidable harm or disproportionate harm? And that could lead to very different verdicts, right? It could be, for instance, that from the consequentialist perspective, you realize relatively good outcomes by killing someone, or so by doing them a lot of harm. A third kind of approach would be based on character. So good is what goes together with a good character. That centers the individual, not the action. So again, very different. And we wanted to look at the ethics of nuclear energy use while being relatively neutral. I don't know which of these approaches I prefer. I guess I'm a kind of pluralist, but I don't want to commit to one of them. And so we try to come up with criteria for what are good energy system development strategies. So strategies of energy system development in the light of different approaches of normative ethics. And we thought, well, there are three criteria that make sense, irrespective of which approach to normative ethics they prefer.
So instead of setting up this framework based on normative ethics, Dr. Friederich and his colleague decided that they were going to create a different set of criteria to evaluate energy systems. So what are they?
The first would be quick. That is basically the criterion that if you are an energy system developer, then you should try to reduce your emissions quickly. right, for the next few years or so, try to bring them down. Another criterion would be zero. That means that says bring down your net emissions to zero on a reasonably quick timescale. That sounds similar to quick, but it's pretty different because the horizon is really to have an idea of how you get to zero emissions. So the recommendations might be rather different because deep decarbonization is quite different from shallow decarbonization. If you want to just reduce emissions in a short term, then maybe it's best to just go for the low-hanging fruit. I think a couple of renewables can be installed pretty fast. They can lower the utilization rates of coal and gas plants and so on. That makes a lot of sense from the perspective of quick. Whereas a large nuclear plant takes a relatively long time to build. So that is probably not quick. But if you want to go to zero on a reasonable time scale, that actually might be pretty good to have reliable 24/7 year-round electricity from a nuclear plant. And the third criterion that we considered is, we call it facilitate. That would be that you invest in such a way, to develop your energy system in such a way that you try to bring down the costs or the hurdles for technology that are generally useful to fully decarbonize.
And not wanting to play into one specific camp created a different framework to analyze energy systems. The criteria they use consist of quick, zero, and facilitate. Quick means that energy system providers should try to quickly reduce their carbon emissions. That could look like oil and gas companies trying to use solar panels to power their field operations. Zero means that energy system providers should be adjusting their horizons to make sure their emissions are reaching net zero over time. This could look like wind turbine factories using carbon capture to offset carbon emissions from the steel manufacturing process. This timeline should be done in a responsible manner, though. Facilitate. This means that we as a collective or government should make it easier to build energy systems that align with net zero initiatives. This could look like the Department of Energy or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission launching a new website to make it easier to file paperwork and submit funding requests. The key here is to use these three criteria in order to evaluate all parts of an energy system.
I think something that set apart our ethical analysis from that of my German colleagues or from the past few decades, also others mentioned, that we really looked at the energy system modeling literature and economics papers. What does the evidence say about how one can relatively quickly, more or less fully decarbonize? There are a couple of studies that suggest that going now all in on variable renewables is the most affordable option and will get us to zero emissions. My impression from the literature is that these studies are not reliable. The evidence that we have from countries that already have very low carbon electricity is that it's a more responsible option in the light of getting to zero emissions to invest some of the resources in firm low carbon power. So that is one that can be switched on and off and is often going at full throttle, I think is the expression, right? The work by Jesse Jenkins and co-workers is very compelling in that regard. I think other works point in a similar direction. Besides geothermal energy, nuclear energy is really the prime option here. From a US point of view, where nuclear energy is regarded as supremely expensive, we think precisely an economic analysis somewhat supports investment in nuclear energy.
So if we evaluate an energy system that already has pretty low carbon emissions, we find that the only way to really get them to zero emissions is through investment in either geothermal energy or nuclear energy. The second point made here is that even in the light of nuclear energy in the United States being expensive to start building, the economic analysis still supports that investment in new nuclear energy is ethically required. So let's take a look at the arguments for existing reactors, building new reactors, and small modular reactors.
So first thing I want to say is that from my point of view in the paper, is usually it's that the case for keeping existing reactors running is very strong, but for new reactors, much more shaky. If you build a new reactor and predict that it will be horrendously more expensive and take many decades or so, then that's probably a bad service. But if you think you can do it critically thought about this, on time and budget, and even if those are currently pretty high because of the effect that this will have globally. People see what can be done. That has more of an impact. So at least in the sense of our criterion facilitate, that might have the better ethical evaluation than just keeping a plant running. The question is, do you keep it for 20 or 30 years? It's not so clear, even if the carbon avoiding costs are lower in the latter case. Then there's the question, what kind of reactors, if we're talking about new build, should be assessed how, preferably in the light of what I've been saying, it would be good to find a way of undercutting fossil fuels on price to produce energy more cheaply. And currently, I think, as my understanding is, for most applications, we are quite far from that for new reactors. There are groups like Radiant Energy that push for a large-scale build-out of large-scale reactors, and they hope that this will bring down costs significantly. I think this is most realistic. But on the other hand, if the build times stay what they are right now, part of the problem with climate change is that we are relatively short-term oriented creatures, right? So we really don't want to refrain from flying now for uncertain benefits for our children or whoever down the road. If we are invited to mitigate climate change by deploying something that asks heavy sacrifices now, but pays off maybe 20 years down the road with relatively affordable energy, that is sort of solving the problem with the same kind of problem. So it would be better to have something that can be implemented much more quickly. So compared to when I wrote the paper, I've become even more convinced it would be really desirable, strengthen the ethical case if the industry could be deregulated in some way to make it faster and more affordable.
So, the ethical case for keeping existing nuclear reactors in place? Pretty good. The ethical case for building new reactors? Depends. If we can build new nuclear reactors on budget and on time, that makes the ethical defense for new nuclear reactors pretty strong. It also facilitates more people around the world able to build them as well. However, in our three-dimensional game of chess, affordable now is better than affordable later. There needs to be heavy legwork in the facilitate department of this energy system, or else it might be increasingly difficult to have public and government buy-in if the economics show that the affordability will pay out 30 years down the line. Instead, we need something a little bit faster.
I think the ethically most desirable actions are the ones that contribute to more widespread access to carbon-free energy and helps with getting to zero emissions. That would be a win-win. I just want to highlight how different we are in our focus from the more traditional ethics literature. Deregulating this technology is quite alien. But on the other hand, the excellent safety record of the nuclear industry in part has to do with the fantastic safety culture. That's my impression from talking to people. And of course, that should stay good.
But what's the public reaction to all of this?
Yes, let's come to this question, how the public attitudes might have to change. There was a philosopher or ethicist from Norway in the 70s. He wrote a paper on energy ethics, and he said that for environmental reasons, developing countries who use nuclear energy because it's better for their environment than using renewables. But because of the proliferation issue, we should hope that they use fossil fuels or preferably hydropower. From the modern point of view, it's completely orthogonal to the discussion. But you're asking about how people's attitudes would have to change. These are largely empirical questions where we have specialists here at my university in Groningen specialized in the acceptance of energy infrastructure. They can answer this kind of question more competently. I think a lot has changed for the better. People are slightly more pro-nuclear than they used to be, I think, 10 years ago, and maybe that trend will continue. But it might still be quite a challenge to find communities that are happy to host. In Germany specifically, nuclear energy in the broad population was always considered very cheap. When the reactors were there, they were really running very, very affordably, I think, at something like operating costs of 2 cents per kilowatt hour, considerably below what they do in the US. And now, I think once they were switched off, that happened almost 2 years ago for the last reactors. I think around that time, public opinion became more supportive of the technology, as long as it's not in their backyard. I think politicians have an eye on how difficult it would be to convince communities, how strong the opposition would be, so they don't want to get into this. Here in the Netherlands, actually, there is a pretty stable consensus, except for the left parties, to build new plants. And actually, it's very sad. In my community, right, we had a place reserved for a large nuclear plant for decades. And then the prime minister 2 years ago said, well, that would be so great for the province if we built one there. But the people weren't ready. They protested, and now it has been taken off. In the Netherlands, the population density is 400 something per square kilometer. So that's really dense. Yeah.
One of the sections in Dr. Friedrich's paper discusses land usage. And I think that's a really important topic when we're evaluating energy systems. What land is available to use for energy production, wastewater treatment, agricultural development, urban planning? What role does proximity play in relation to the adoption of nuclear technologies? i.e., if it's close to you, are you still going to want it?
A lot of the demands of climate protesters are probably counterproductive because they regularly block highways. And that really divides society, I think. There is a minority of people who think that's great, and that is really the kind of action that we need. But I think most, especially the people who really keep society going, it gets on their nerves. I think this mainly backfires, right? My hunch would be, let's try to get out of that blockade mood and see how we can, without sacrificing the achievements of safety, how we can deploy technologies that allow us to live as well as before and maybe better, while without emitting.
If you're listening to this podcast and you're wondering, does this even apply to you? Well, yeah. Whether you're arguing in favor of or against nuclear energy, I think it's important to be able to start to discuss some of these ethical frameworks in how we decide to evaluate our energy systems and what we want to do about it on a daily basis. Even if that's a middle-of-the-road approach, it might not sound exciting, but keeping existing nuclear reactor plants open, finding cheap and ethical replacements for fossil fuels, facilitating the faster production of new nuclear power plants. And remembering in this 3D game of chess, choosing the right move 100% of the time might not actually be the right move. Now it's time for our rapid fire questions. What drew you to both physics and philosophy?
I studied these two disciplines with this tailor-made construction at the University of Göttingen. I've always been enthusiastic about philosophy, but I always had respect also for physics. When I studied them, what really shocked me was that the basic language for all of fundamental physics is quantum theory. But it's actually pretty mysterious how the world can possibly be such that quantum theory works, how this can really describe the world or be effective as a means of interacting with the world is condensed in the so-called measurement problem of quantum theory. I learned about that 20 years ago, and it has never lost its grip on me.
Are there any favorite questions or philosophical questions that you like to ask your students?
Oh, yeah, there are lots of things that I ask my students. I often like to shock my students a bit by making it appear in the beginning of a course that this will be super difficult, and then they are happy. If we can do some things, I get decent grades. When students that I know a bit better, maybe after a course when we have drinks, I like to ask them about their plans for whether they want to have kids and so on. So not personally, but in general, there's this low fertility thing going on, and it's interesting to see whether students are aware that fertility peaks at their age. There is the connection between this and the energy and climate questions, because I think we want the next generations to flourish, have a decent amount of energy that they can use, and a climate that allows us to preserve a lot of the beautiful nature.
Do you have any hobbies that you like to get up to? Anything that you do in your spare time that you find pretty fun and exciting?
My hobbies, I love being in the mountains here in Europe, in the Alps or Pyrenees. I do a lot of classical music, not very original, but I really carry forward this traditional Western culture, and my children participate.
And then my final question on this is, if you had to give a speech or a TED Talk on a topic that is not related to philosophy or physics or anything that you've studied, what other passion would you have that you would want to give a talk about?
Yep. I like to talk about lots of things, but I always need to remind me that there are often always people who know better, right? And I can tell you that in 2023, I spent the year, after having written on nuclear energy, I spent the year writing papers related to advanced AI and how it might interact with society. Even though I'm not a machine learning expert, I feel a bit inadequate, but the papers have appeared in good venues. And whether AI systems will be subject to natural selection in the future and will become selfish and driven towards resource acquisition. I have given sort of TED Talks on this to certain audiences, and I've had fun because I'm always a bit scared about these things. So I could mention that.
So just kind of closing up, would like to hear about or think should be had around nuclear energy, or things that you want to know more about?
I would really like to have some clear ideas, get some clear ideas, what kind of concrete measures could be taken to make this technology better deployable, especially here in Europe, because that's where I live, right? But also debate about ALARA based on LNT. I hope your listeners know what we're talking about, how low radiation levels must be in the operation of nuclear plants and so on. So it's unclear to me how good this justification for ALARA is. I wish I had some colleagues who would, with a constructive motivation, would look into this, right? So that would be really nice.
Taking the time to frame ethical arguments can help us understand long-term effects and consequences for our actions. Even if we might be intending to do something good, it might have a bad outcome. That's why it's also necessary to evaluate our current energy systems under an ethical framework. That way, we can understand what parts aren't beneficial to all parts of society and how we can improve them. That's something I think nuclear energy has the capacity to be able to do. A special thanks to Dr. Simone Friederich for taking time out of his day to come sit down with us and talk about his paper. In addition, I wanted to thank him for even writing the paper. Even though nuclear ethics is not his specialty, I think it's important for everybody in the energy space who cares about the climate to work on projects that they might not be specialists in. It can have far greater impact than I think we all realize. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this episode and work through this three-dimensional game of nuclear ethics chess with me. I know I learned a lot, and I hope you did too. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate it or leave a comment. And what other questions on ethics and philosophy should we ask in relation to nuclear energy or just energy systems in general? Thanks again for listening to this episode of Naked Nuclear. I'm your host, Danielle. Stay curious. If you're not up to speed with what happened in Germany, here's a bit of context. Germany is now looked at as a cautionary tale of what happens when you shut down all of your reactors without really insightful forethought of how you're going to replace that power lost within the grid. If you're not up to speed with what happened in Germany, here's a bit of context. Germany is now looked at as a cautionary tale of what happens when you shut down all of your reactors without really insightful forethought of how you're going to replace that power lost within the grid.